All right, in this lesson, we're going to talk about the View Router. So what we're going to do here is we're going to create a new project. We're going to add View Router. And we'll take a peek at the application and see what was generated for us. Then what I'll do is I'll take an existing project, something that we've already created, and take a look at how we can add View Router to an existing project without just the kind of manual way of installing the dependency. So let's start here from the command line. It doesn't matter where you're doing this from, whether it's git bash or terminal, or in my case, I'm using iterm. We're just starting using the View CLI. We're going to create a new application. So I'm in a View folder, and I'm going to just create, let's say, View Router Rocks. And that's going to go ahead and prompt us. And what I want to do is go ahead and manually select. So we've all done this before, but what we haven't done yet is actually select the router. So what we want to do is we want to go down to the router. We're going to hit the space bar so it's selected. And now that we could see, we're using Babel, router, and linting. So for this example, that's all I'm going to do. I'm going to hit enter. And then it's going to ask me for history mode on the router. We're just going to choose yes. You can go into the documentation for View Router and read more about what history mode is and why you might want to use it. But I like to go ahead and use that on every project. So then we're just going to accept the defaults on everything else. And we're going to go ahead and let it install for us. Once it's done installing, we'll go ahead and open up this project in Visual Studio Code. And we'll take a walk through and take a look at what it actually created for us. All right, so here I am in Visual Studio Code, and we're just going to take a look around and just take a look at what the generated code looks like. What happened when we told it to select View Router. So one of the things that it did is if we go into package.json, one of the things that we have now is the View Router. So again, Vue is the routing library. It's the official routing library of Vue.js, but it's not part of the core dependencies that get installed. That's why we had to select it. So we can see the specific version of View Router that we're using here. Next, if we go into source, we're going to see a couple of things. And again, this should all look pretty familiar if you've gone ahead through the documentation. If you haven't gone through the student book yet, I would suggest just kind of reading through it pretty quickly just to understand what we're talking about here. So the first thing that it gave us is this router.js, and this is going to create our new router instance, and it's going to configure some routes for us. So what you didn't see in the documentation is this about, because I cleaned it up for you just a little bit. This, the way that they've set up the about one is basically lazy loading the route, and we're not going to go too much into this. This is, again, for kind of larger applications when you don't want to load every route at once. But again, I don't want to get into that. So one thing that you could do here is just delete that. And then what we could do is you could import the, so we can say about, and we can pull in the about view, and then we can just say component about, and that'll get us to basically where we need to be. So this is the important file when it comes to defining your route. So in this route array here, we need to define all of the different routes that are going to be in our application. And where these components usually live is in the views folder. So it created a views folder for us and created us two views. You can think of these as like pages. And again, I mentioned this in the documentation, but there's really no difference between the components folder and the views folder. They are both going to contain view components. The only difference being that anything in a views folder is really going to have a route associated with it. And because of the way that we load these views, they don't follow the typical naming standards that a component does. So you'll see like hello world or site navigation or view button or all of these things that we name our components, they follow some different rules. And one of those, which is it's really going to have at least, it can't be one word names, right? And the reason for that is we don't want to confuse those with normal HTML elements when we go ahead and place them in markup. Well, again, these home view and this about view, they're getting loaded into our application using view router, and we'll take a look at how that works in a second. But because of that, we can name these things like home.view and about.view. So this routes is really kind of where the magic happens as far as, hey, when I visit /about, I want you to go ahead and load the about view. So this is where we'll be when we're trying to customize that. Now, right next to that in main, we see something different here too. If you look at this import router from, so this is that router JS file, and what it's doing here is it's passing it in as an option to that new view instance there. And so that's important because it's saying, hey, when you go ahead and create this view instance, here's the router that I want you to use. Here's the router configuration with all of the settings that I want you to use for the router, and here are all my routes associated with it. So those two steps are pretty important. And I think that's about it. If we go into the actual views, you'll see they're just normal components. As I said, in this case, this home view is actually loading another component from the components folder called Hello World. So just like it did in a previous example where it might have loaded this in app.view, it's now loading it here. And then we have an about view, and this just contains a template. There is no script, there is no CSS, and that's fine. That's really all it needs. And so that is kind of the base project that you get when you create a new project using the view router. Now, there are some different ways to go about this when you have an existing project. So what I want to do is I'm going to open up a project here, and I have just a normal Hello World. So this is just a regular Hello World project, but it has no view router. So if we were to look in package.json, we don't have the view router. So again, I mentioned this in the documentation. We could easily come in here and say npm install view router, right? Because as we saw, it's just a dependency. But if we were to do that, then what we'd have to do to kind of make all of this work is we'd have to create that router.js, basically write all that configuration code, set up our routes. Then we'd have to go into main.js, import it, add it to the view instance. We'd have to go in and create a views folder. We'd have to add that information, those different views to the views folder. So it's not as easy as just installing a dependency. But luckily for us, Vue gives us a really nice way of adding new plugins or presets using the Vue add command. And so what we're going to do here is we're going to use that and see what it does for us. So let's say Vue add, and then in this case, we're adding the Vue router. In this case, it's just a router. So we say Vue add router. And let's go and see what it says. So do you remember you saw this particular question when we created our project from scratch, right? After that first step, it said, hey, do you want to use history mode? And I said, yeah, let's go ahead and use that. It's doing the same thing. It saw that you want router, so now it's going to ask you any questions associated with that particular plugin. So in this case, we're just going to say yes, and that's really all there is to it. It's going to do all of the same stuff that it did before for us, and it's even going to give us a little printout of what it did. So it says, successfully invoked generator for plugin core router, and it says the following files have been updated or added. So we know that that router file is there, so that looks exactly like that did before. The main file is here where it imports router and adds it to our Vue instance. It's got this nice views folder where it has our home and our about view. And if we look at package.json, we now have the Vue router dependency. So it's really easy to do. Sometimes I know I was confused when I first started Vue, like how do I add a particular feature to my project after it's already been created? You don't need to go through and create a new project and then port code over. It's very easy to add features to existing projects, and I hope this kind of showed you that there. So I think that's it. Just two ways to go ahead and add view router. So we can do it when we're creating a new project from scratch, or we can easily, as you just saw, add it to an existing project. So I hope that helped with getting up and running with view router. I would keep going through the documentation here, and there's lots more to learn when it comes to the router. So I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you in another lesson.